Our primary mission is to help. We're an information resource. We host monthly talks like this one. We also have classes and tours. We have a digital magazine called the Centered on Taiwan. You can scan a QR code here and it will take you to that magazine. This event is being live streamed, and we will post a full recording of this on our website in about 2 weeks. We are also a licensed mental health center. We have 13 psychologists on staff on the sixth floor, working with people on just about any issue you can imagine. So with that, I want to thank Agile Relocation. They sponsored the coffee morning. And I want to thank Jordan Brown. This is third time we've tried to do this. So third time is a charm. The first two times we had to cancel because of COVID. And I ran into Jordan last fall and like, we want to try it again. I went to bed last night halfway thinking we were going to have a typo. But we did. So I'm very happy to introduce and hand it over to Jordan Brown.
Can everyone hear me without the mic, or are we okay in the back? Great. So I'll try not. Yes? We're all good without the mic? Great, thanks. So my name's Jordan. I teach at TAS, and I gave a talk here, I think around 2016, and then I tried to do it again a couple times, and COVID got in the way. So I'm glad to be back. So I got here in 2007, and I moved here thinking that I'd be here for a couple of years, and then move on to another international school, and now it's 2024, and I'm here again. So it's been 17 years in Taiwan, and obviously I really enjoy living here, and I think it's a great place. I've learned a lot about Taiwan over the last 17 years. I've tried to cram a lot of that into this talk I'm about to give to you. If you know a lot about Taiwan history, hopefully there's something new. If you don't know that much about Taiwan's complicated past, hopefully I'm giving you a good overview of this so you can understand why Taiwan is the way that it is. It's not like a lot of other countries in the world, and we're going to get into why that's the case. So the big question, of course, is, what exactly is Taiwan? And, who are the people of Taiwan? When I first moved here in 2007, I said I'm moving to Taiwan, and people used to think when they first heard that I lived in Taiwan, and they say something like, "Oh, Thailand, great. I love Thai food." And then you'd have to have that awkward conversation of, actually, I live in Taiwan. Thailand's a different country. You've sort of insulted their intelligence. But I'm sure we've all had that experience elsewhere. Today, I don't get that very much anymore. I think people know a lot more about Taiwan recently. And it's not always necessarily because of the greatest reasons. I don't know if you remember this Economist cover that called Taiwan the most dangerous place on earth about a year or two ago. But for many people outside of Taiwan, that's how they view Taiwan. However, I think we all know that we're not feeling that danger necessarily every day. We experience Taiwan in our daily lives in different ways. I would say this is how we experience Taiwan, right? Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world, but for Taiwanese dogs to put their paws down, it's very dangerous. So, really, what is Taiwan, and is it a part of China? Is it its own nation? Let's ask China and see what they say. So here is straight from their website. Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. All right, so the People's Republic of China claims Taiwan. They say Taiwan has always been part of China. That's not quite the case. So let's move away from China. They're not the most trustworthy source. Let's go to Google. Google knows everything. At least that's what my students tell me. So we go to Google. We look up map of China on Google, and you'll notice the first map on Google shows you a map of China in yellow. And right off the coast, you'll see Taiwan in yellow. And in fact, I think the first 3 or 4 results all say that there are maps with Taiwan shown as part of China. So it's confusing. All right, so that doesn't quite work. How about we go to where all the nations of the world compete in the Olympics, right? If they're the nations, they're there. So let's go to Paris. How nice. So before we get there, we need to get on a plane to go to Paris, right? We have to book a flight. So let's make a reservation on an international flight. What happens when we make a reservation? Go to KLM's website and look, I live in Taiwan, China. This happens all the time when you're trying to book flights or sign up for things on the internet, right? It says Taiwan, province of China, or Taiwan, China. We're on the KLM Taiwan, China website. So let's fly on an airline from Taiwan. Let's just fly up. Oh, wait, hold on a second. The airline out of Taiwan that we want to fly is called China Airlines. So this is getting a little bit confusing, right? Where are we exactly? Okay, we finally got there. Let's say we took the China Airlines flight. We're in Paris. We're looking for Team Taiwan at the Olympics. And we show up and we look around and it's Chinese Taipei. There is no Taiwan competing in the Olympics. It's Chinese Taipei. What is Chinese Taipei? And they have this weird looking flag that they're flying, right? So in international competitions, there is no Taiwan. There's Chinese Taipei, and they have this flag. But in that flag, you might notice something that looks a little bit familiar. Maybe you've seen this symbol before. There it is. And this, of course, is the official flag of the country known as the Republic of China. All right, 中华民国. And that symbol that you see in the upper left-hand corner of the ROC flag is actually the flag of the KMT. All right, so a political party that was formed in China in the early 20th century, the Kuomintang, or the Chinese Nationalist Party. This is their flag. So it's getting really complicated. All right, let's check out the passports. Passports always tell you what country you are from. Here's the old passport. You'll see on it, it says both Republic of China and Taiwan. It's a little bit confusing, so they fixed it. This is the current passport that people use in Taiwan. And you'll notice that in English, it says Taiwan very big. And up there in Mandarin characters, right, you can see that it says Republic of China, but they got rid of the Republic of China. Though if you look really close, it's in here still. All right, so both Republic of China and Taiwan. So what is Taiwan then, right? Is it the Republic of China? Is it China? Is it Chinese Taipei? That's why we're here after all, right? That's why we're here to figure this out, because it is complicated. Most other countries, it's pretty obvious what country you're in. You know where you are. The passports are very clear. Taiwan, not so much. So let's dig in. We got a lot to cover. The first thing I want to do is show you a quote from a professor at Stanford University. I am not related to her, but she says, how do we define a group of people, or what is identity? She says, culture and ancestry are not what ultimately unite an ethnic group or a nation. Rather, identity is formed and solidified on the basis of common social experience, including economic and political experience. So I want you to keep that in mind, right? Common social experience and both economic and political experience is what defines what a group is. And so how Taiwan understands its own history matters. J. Megan Green, a professor at Kansas University, says, unlike most other parts of the world, Taiwan's future depends to a considerable extent on interpretations of the past. Just how the majority of the population understands Taiwan's past may have considerable impact on what sort of future it will face. So we're going to be going through that history so we understand where Taiwan came from and where they might go. Our last quote is from a professor at Seton Hall University in the US. And he says, by shaping collective memory, governments can uphold their own legitimacy and find reasons to topple that of others. So the battle of memory and history, are very important to understanding what Taiwan is and what it might become. And so I want to use a lens for today, all right? Benedict Anderson was a professor in London for many, many years. He wrote this book called Imagine Community, and it's about the births of nations and nationalism, which was a pretty new phenomenon, actually, at the beginning of the 20th century. And I want to use his idea in this book called Imagined Communities as a lens for us to look back at Taiwan's complicated past and present. And so he says that the nation is an imagined political community. And people in these imagined communities will never know when the people in their imagined communities, but will live in the image of their communion. So you may think you're part of a nation, but you don't know everybody in your nation, but you live as, say, an American, right? I grew up in Pennsylvania. What do I have in common with someone from North Dakota? I don't know. I never met someone from North Dakota, but we're both American, right? And we live this idea of being Americans. And so he says communities are then distinguished by the style in which they are imagined. All right? So I want you to think of Taiwan as an imagined community. All nations are imagined communities, and they are imagined by the people inside of them. So let's go back to that, all right? We're going to come back to this idea and talk about the different imagined communities of Taiwan. So here are the different imagined communities. I've put them in a big list here, so if you don't know the different time periods of Taiwan's history, you'll see them, and then we're going to go through all of them. We have a lot to talk about. First, we have Taiwan before Sinicization. All right, this is the indigenous dominated era. This is the era when Taiwan was only inhabited by people not of Chinese descent. They were here many hundreds of years and sometimes thousands of years before the Chinese people started arriving. Then we have a variety of colonial eras. The first colonial era is going to be the Dutch. And so the Dutch ruled Taiwan from 1624 to 1661. The second colonial era is going to be when 𝗕𝗃 comes from China and sets up a pro-Ming dynasty to try to reconquer China, which was taken over by the Qing Dynasty, which were ruled by Manchurians. So he's going to rule for about 20 years. The third colonial era is when Taiwan falls under control of the Qing Dynasty. And so this is a Chinese dynasty, but ruled by foreigners, the Manchurians. And this is going to be a pretty long time, a little over 200 years. So that's the third colonial era of Taiwan. The fourth colonial era is going to be the Japanese occupation. So from 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was controlled by Japan and ruled as part of their empire. Then there's a brief interlude. Between 1945 and 1949, Taiwan is included as part of China. And that China is going to be ruled by a country called the Republic of China, when they were still back in China. All right? So that's a very short time period. They're going to lose a civil war back in China, and then they're going to come here, and they're going to rule as an authoritarian country. And so from 1945 to around 1987 or so, Taiwan is ruled as part of the Republic of China, and I'm calling this a colonial era, and we'll come back to this later on and explain why that is the case. And then our last era is the one that we're in. So I'm calling this Taiwan becomes Taiwan. So from the 1990s to today, Taiwan has transformed itself from being an authoritarian dictatorship into a democracy where the people have voice, and Taiwan is now imagining itself as a different place than it had been in the past. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to go through all of that. Some of these things we're going to talk about in a little more detail than others. We only have so much time. So let's get started. We have a couple objects. Either sometimes they're objects and sometimes they are photographs that I've taken in Tianmu, and I'm using them as sort of segues or ways to look at the time periods that we're looking at. So the first one is this. This is a Confucian scholar bobblehead doll that I keep on my desk at work. He's cute and you hit his head. All right. So we all know that Confucianism originated from China, and eventually this is going to come to Taiwan. And it's going to become part of this new imagined community in Taiwan. So the first era that we need to look at is the era before Sinicization or Chineseification. The island of Taiwan was inhabited by indigenous people who are not Chinese. All right? And if you look at the map here, you can see the island separated out into a variety of different groups. All of these different groups have different languages, they have different cultures, and we could go into a lot of details about the differences between them. We don't really have the time. But for us, it's important to know that all the way up until about the beginning of the 17th century, this is what Taiwan was. There was no united kingdom. There was no emperor. There were just lots of different groups who did not always get along with each other. All right? And they had different areas. And you can see that some of them are down on the Western Plains. Today, we know that many of the indigenous groups live on the East Coast or in the mountainous areas. That wasn't always the case, right? They used to live all over the island. So that area is going to come to an end when the Dutch start arriving. I'm just going to move that there. So the Dutch arrived in 1624. This was the Dutch heyday. The Dutch also controlled another little island during the same exact time period in North America. They used to control New York City, or they called it New Amsterdam, at the same time that they controlled Taiwan. So they are here, and one of the things that's most important for us to understand about the Dutch era is this is the era when Chinese people start coming to Taiwan in large numbers. And it's because of the Dutch. The Dutch encourage farmers to come from China to do the work for them. And so you see a number of people arrive in Taiwan from Southeast China during this era. The Dutch are situated down in what is down today, modern-day Tainan, all right? And if you go down there, you can see their fort. Maybe you've gone to Tainan and you visited Fort Zeelandia. So they're growing rice, they're trading in deer skins, and they're encouraging Chinese people from Fujian province, right across the Taiwan Strait, to come to Taiwan and do the work for the Dutch. This is the first significant permanent presence of Chinese people in Taiwan. And there have been traders coming to the island before, but this is when they first start arriving and staying in larger numbers. And it's because of, interestingly, the Dutch. The Dutch rule ends in 1660 when 𝗕𝗄𝗃, or 𝗕𝗄𝗃 attacks. He is from China, but he's also an interesting person. So his father was Chinese and actually a very wealthy pirate who got co-opted by the Ming and then the Qing Dynasty. His mother was Japanese. So when the Ming Dynasty in China, which was a Chinese dynasty, fell in 1644, not everyone wanted the new Qing Dynasty to rule. So many people fought back. 𝗕𝗄𝗃 was one of them. And he fought back for about 20 years in southeastern China, trying to erect a new Ming dynasty. And eventually, he was unable to win. So what he did is he fled to Taiwan. And his goal in fleeing to Taiwan was to set up sort of a pro-Ming dynasty and then go back to China to take it over. Obviously, that never happened. That should also give you some echoes of the future if you know a little bit of the history in the 20th century. So this is the era where we see a greater Sinicization of Taiwan. He's bringing Chinese culture to Taiwan from China, all right? And his goal is to go back, which of course he never does. But what he does bring is Chinese culture, like Confucianism. So here is the Tainan Confucius Temple. You can go visit this as a tourist. This was built in 1666 during the 𝗕𝗄𝗃 era. And so Chinese culture is coming to Taiwan, and they're really trying to replicate a Chinese system in Taiwan, and people from China are ruling Taiwan for the first time. It doesn't last that long, though, because the Qing Dynasty has decided that perhaps they want to take over Taiwan. And in 1681, the Qing rulers have a debate about whether they should annex and incorporate Taiwan into its burgeoning empire, right? The Qing Dynasty is growing the size of China. They are from originally northeast of China, in what is today's China, but they're basically from north of North Korea, the Manchurians. And they are expanding the size of China, and they're incorporating it into their empire. And so they decide, should we take Taiwan? They have a debate about this. The Kangxi Emperor says, Taiwan is no bigger than a ball of mud. We gain nothing by possessing it, and it would be no loss if we did not acquire it. Taiwan is outside the empire and of no great consequence. So here is the leader of what we think of as a Chinese dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, saying essentially, what is this place? We don't want this. This is not worth our time, right? This is him in 1681. A scholar official who's at this point discussing with them about what they should do says, the native savages are a stupid people. They have no family names, no ancestral worship, And apart from their own father and mother, they do not recognize paternal or maternal uncles. They are unfamiliar with the calendar. Moreover, they do not know their own ages. By nature, they like to kill people. You can see that the people in the Qing Dynasty are looking at Taiwan with great disdain. And they're also using Confucianism here to denigrate the cultural beliefs of the natives who are on Taiwan. A Chinese admiral was also involved in this discussion, and he says, Taiwan is a natural shield for China. It is not only abundant in fertile soil, but also farm products and natural resources. Furthermore, the Dutch may try to occupy Taiwan again, and the safety of the Penghu Islands between Taiwan and China will be jeopardized. And so here you see someone discussing the geopolitical importance of Taiwan. This argument won out. And so the Qing Dynasty invades. They topple 𝗕𝗙ance sons who had actually taken over by this point, and they incorporate Taiwan into the Qing Dynasty. And so this becomes what I call the third colonial era. From 1683 to 1895, Taiwan is a part of the Qing Dynasty, which was China, as we think of it. So our second object that we're using to understand this era is your local temple near your house, or this is the local temple near my house. I'm pretty sure that we all live near various temples in Taipei. They're all over the island, and these are evidences of Chinese culture coming to Taiwan, and they're everywhere, right? Every neighborhood has one of these. I don't understand what's going on in all of the temples. I'm not going to lie to you. This is my one area that I'm not an expert. I do not understand all of the ins and outs of temple life. But there are various gods in here that people pray to for good luck. They all come from China, essentially. All right? And that's because during the Qing era, we actually see a lot of people move to Taiwan from China. The Qing Dynasty actually doesn't want this. The Qing Dynasty doesn't want people moving to Taiwan, but because life on the southeastern coast over there is actually quite difficult, it's very mountainous, and many people look for a better life. And so they move to Taiwan. And they're all moving from essentially Fujian province. All right, that's where most of the people coming to Taiwan during the Qing era are coming from. And they're speaking languages that today we call Taiwanese. But these languages are not Taiwanese. These languages are from Fujian. It's a Minnan language. And they're essentially, there's a couple different versions of it, but that's what they're speaking. So that means that in the Qing Dynasty, if you came here and you listen to people talking, they'd be speaking a language that originally came from Southeast China. And today we call it Taiwanese, right? It's mutually unintelligible to Mandarin, which we're going to talk about later. So it's these people, and they're coming to Taiwan. If you look at the maps, you'll notice they're pretty much only moving to the coast. And so the part of the Qing Dynasty colonial era is that they only controlled the west coast. They did not control the mountains or the east coast. So they never took over the entire island. Indigenous peoples controlled the central part of the island in the mountains and on the east coast. They even set up barriers. There was like a fence that's set up between the west coast and the center and then the east coast. So they separated out the indigenous people from the Taiwanese. Now, with that being said, many of the immigrants who arrived were men. And so what happened is that many of these immigrants, men, ended up marrying indigenous people, women, and then they had children. But this is not often talked about a lot in Taiwan because the father's name is the one that gets passed down. So if you go back far enough, there's actually a high percentage of people in Taiwan who have descendants from this era who actually have indigenous roots. But usually because of Chinese culture, it's traced through the male line. And so the female line is often sort of forgotten. Meanwhile, back in China, the 19th century Qing Dynasty was not going well for them. There's a lot we could talk about this, but Many people in China have become addicted to opium, thanks to the British, who have decided that they can sell this very easily and make a significant amount of money. So they're having huge problems related to this. They're fighting wars over this. In the middle of the 19th century, there's a massive rebellion led by a guy who believes he's Jesus' brother. True story. It ends up being probably the largest civil war in the entire world. Tens of millions of people die as a result of this man who believed that he was Jesus' brother, God's Chinese son. Eventually, they end this, but it destroys huge swaths of central China. So the Qing Dynasty is really struggling in the 19th century, and foreigners are taking over. They're doing whatever they want, right? And so they're taking over the ports. They're not following Qing law, and the Qing Dynasty is sort of teetering along. And then the Japanese and the Qing Dynasty go to war. This war is actually over access to Korea, which is a bit complicated, but the Japanese go to war against the Qing Dynasty, and they are going to win. And so our next object that we're going to look at, that's going to segue us into our Japanese colonial era, is the baseball stadium in 𝗕𝗄. Who's been to a game in the stadium up there? Did you get put on the big screen? Yeah, okay. So the 𝗕𝗄 Dragons baseball stadium, what does this have to do with the Japanese era? Well, the Japanese are going to colonize from 1895 to 1945. That was not their goal. Their goal was to colonize forever. The treaty they signed with the Qing Dynasty actually said they get to control Taiwan forever. It doesn't end up being that way. It ends up only being 50 years. And for the Japanese, they actually use Taiwan as a model colony. They're going to be colonizing Korea at the exact same time period, 1910, and then also through to 1945. Taiwan is for Japan to show the rest of the world how civilized the Japanese are. And they're going to take these uncivilized people in Taiwan, and they're going to turn them into modern people. They're also going to take their stuff in the meantime. So they're going to grow significant amounts of sugar in Taiwan. They're going to send that back to Japan. They're going to increase the production of rice. They're going to send that back to Taiwan. They're going to start chocolate companies. The Meiji Chocolate Company, which was based out of Taiwan. You probably have had that at 7-Eleven at some point. And they also introduced the sport of baseball. So baseball comes to Taiwan thanks to the Japanese. And they actually see this as a way to civilize people in Taiwan. The sport will take them away from their savage ways and teach them to be civilized people. And so Taiwan's love affair with baseball actually starts in the Japanese era. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit. They also start imposing their beliefs in Taiwan. So during this era, they bring Shinto shrines. These torii gates are all over Taipei. And some of them are in places that you might recognize, maybe you don't recognize. This is the Taiwan Shrine and the Meiji Bridge in 1936. I'm not sure if you recognize this place, but this is where the Grand Hotel is located today. So eventually this all gets torn down and they build that hotel on top of that. Eventually, Japan is going to go to war against China and then the United States and their allies during World War II. Many Taiwanese will actually fight for Japan during this war. Some will be conscripted and some will sign up. And so there are some people in Taiwan who see themselves as truly Japanese and they're proud to fight for Japan. Some have changed their names, so they no longer have Chinese-style names, they have Japanese names. Some of this is forced upon them, some do it voluntarily. And so our next object that we're going to look at is the address of our building right here where we are today. And so here's our address, 238 Zhongshan North Road. And I want to talk about this, Zhongshan. What is Zhongshan? If you've traveled around Taiwan, you probably have noticed every single town has a Zhongshan Road. It does not mean that there's a middle mountain around. It does not refer to Middle Mountain, okay? It actually refers to this guy, which hopefully you recognize. If you're not, I'll let you know. This is Sun Yat-sen, okay? Sun Yat-sen. Or he's also called 𝗔𝗯cie𝘂𝘁. So this street out in front of us is named after him. He's from China. He's also the father of the KMT. So the KMT political party that is founded right after the Qing Dynasty collapses, he's the founder of this party back in China. He's also the guy on the 50 NT coin, which I'm a big fan of. I love the 50 NT coin. You can have a whole meal of dumplings on that one coin. So whenever I see that coin, I try to make sure I have one on me so I can use that. He's also the guy who never set foot in Taiwan. So this street is named after someone who has really actually nothing to do with Taiwan, which is why things are complicated here. And so let's go back to China again. On October 10th, 1911, there was a revolt against the Qing Dynasty. This was led by Chinese nationalists who were tired of their country being poor, being picked on by foreigners, and they thought that the Manchurians, the people running the Qing Dynasty, were the real problem. And so they tried to overthrow it. You might notice this date, October 10th. All right? There's a holiday that we celebrate in Taiwan, 10/10. This is the date of the start of the overthrow of the Qing Dynasty. What was happening in Taiwan on October 10th, 1911? I have no idea, nothing. The Japanese were here colonizing. So this was an event back in China. The Qing Dynasty collapsed in 1912. There's 𝗕𝗄𝘲, the last emperor of the Qing Dynasty. He's the boy on the right. So he abdicates his throne, and Sun Yat-sen, 𝗔𝗯cie𝘂𝘁, who had been trying to overthrow the Qing Dynasty for years, becomes the new president of the Republic of China. It's only in China. It's not here in Taiwan because the Japanese are here. All right? He is a Chinese nationalist. However, he doesn't really have the power to control the country. So he rules the Republic of China for 1 month. That's the end of it. That's the last time he has any power in China, 1 month. Power instead is passed to 𝗕𝗏𝟘, who was a former general in the Qing Dynasty, and he's going to rule the country for the next 6 years as essentially a dictator. So this new country, the Republic of China, is formed, and they create a new flag for themselves. And you probably recognize the flag on the right. That's the flag that we see for the Republic of China today. The flag on the left is actually the Republic of China flag between 1912 and 1928. It actually speaks to who the founders of the Republic of China were. They were Chinese nationalists who were trying to get rid of the Manchurians and reestablish order with Han Chinese people as the rulers of the country. So they made a flag based on this, with the Han people on top, and then the Manchus below them, and then the Mongols below them, and then the Hui people, Muslims, below them, and then the Tibetans on the bottom. So this was the flag of the Republic of China for the first 16 years or so. It's sort of awkwardly racist, so they got rid of it eventually. And now they have this flag that we all recognize here. So the Republic of China in China will be there from 1912 to 1949, right, when they're going to lose a civil war and flee to Taiwan. So that's the Republic of China in China. But it's a bit rough. When 𝗕𝗏𝟘 dies, the country essentially falls apart, and it descends into chaos. There are a number of different warlords, which I like to describe as guys with guns bigger than other guys with other guns. So they take over different parts of China. On this map, you can see these little blobs are essentially different warlords controlling different parts of China. So from 1916 to 1927, the Republic of China ceased to exist as a functional, united country anymore. If you were in charge of the area in Beijing, you were the president of the Republic of China. But you didn't control this area down here. You didn't control here. You didn't control here. You were just the nominal president of a country that didn't really exist except on paper. So if you go to Wikipedia and you look at all the presidents of the Republic of China, you're going to see Sun Yat-sen, 𝗕𝗏𝟘𝘂𝘁, a whole bunch of dudes you don't know, don't need to know, because some of them ruled for a month, 2 months, until they got taken over by somebody else. And then in 1927, this guy's going to take over. So Sun Yat-sen had returned to China. He fled to Japan in the middle of the 19 teens, and he returns in the late 19 teens trying to overthrow these warlords. He never did it, but he managed to get help from this guy, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was actually a gangster in the 19 teens in Shanghai, but also a Chinese nationalist and wanted to overthrow the warlord period. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, and Chiang Kai-shek became the successor to him in the KMT. They led a military expedition in 1927, and they took over China. So starting in 1927, the Republic of China is under Chiang Kai-shek, who is an authoritarian leader. He's the head of a political party called the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party. And he's going to rule from Nanjing, all right, that's where they have the capital, until 1937. 1937 is when Japan is going to invade. So Japan is going to try to take over China in 1937, and Chiang Kai-shek is valiantly and barely holding on to his country. Luckily for him, the Japanese make a grave error by attacking the United States in 1941, which brings them into this war. And so first, this was the Second Sino-Japanese War, right? Where Chiang Kai-shek is just barely holding on to his country. In fact, moves the capital to Chongqing in the southwest provinces of China. So now the United States is going to be helping him out. And there they are. So they send military aid. This photograph is a very inaccurate description of actually what was going on. The United States did not love Chiang Kai-shek, but they really wanted to stop the Japanese and taking over the entire region of Asia. So they sent significant military aid while they were also trying to defeat the Japanese in the island hopping campaigns in the Pacific. This is the American general that got sent to work with Chiang Kai-shek. They look like they're having a good time, but Joseph Stilwell actually hated Chiang Kai-shek. He had a nickname for him. He called him Peanut because of the shape of his head. So in his letters back home, he'd write to his wife, "Peanut's acting up again," things like that. Other Americans also did not love Chiang Kai-shek either. So they kept sending him money, and the money just kept disappearing. So there was another phrase that they used to call him. Instead of Chiang Kai-shek, they used to call him General Cash My Check. So they're allies, but they're not getting along that great. However, in 1943, in the middle of World War II, an important moment happened that's going to be relevant to Taiwan, which is under Japanese control still. In Cairo, Egypt, Chiang Kai-shek, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Sun Mei-ling, meet in Cairo, and they're trying to figure out what's going to happen when we win this war. They're planning for the future, which is a good idea. And what they decide is that Taiwan would become part of China, the ROC, when the war was over. They did not ask the people of Taiwan, would you like to be independent? Would you like to stay part of Japan? Do you want to be part of China? There was no consideration. So Chiang Kai-shek decides, you know what? Taiwan's part of my China. It was part of the Qing Dynasty, so I want it to be part of my new China. And we want this back. And the Americans and the Brits say, sure, why not? Whatever. They don't really care that much. They just want to defeat the Japanese. So they agree to this. And so in 1945, when the Japanese are defeated, Taiwan is briefly reintegrated into China, the Republic of China. This is only going to last for 4 years because soon China is going to disappear in a civil war, and then they're going to move to Taiwan. And in fact, it really doesn't go well, this reintegration. The first 2 years of the ROC in Taiwan is one in which they are taking many of the food and the resources from Taiwan to use it because they're now in another war back in China against the Chinese Communist Party. And people in Taiwan feel like they're being mistreated. And eventually, this anger towards the ROC bubbles up. And a revolt starts on February 28th, 1947, 228, or Ba. And the Taiwanese people almost take over the entire island. Chiang Kai-shek hears what's happening, sends in the troops, and they begin slaughtering people indiscriminately. All right? Tens of thousands of people are murdered. Many people are disappeared. And many of the people who are disappeared are leading people in society. Doctors, lawyers, the most educated people, the people who are the greatest threats to his regime here. And so at the same time, we have the Chinese Civil War. This is going on between Mao Zedong and his Chinese Communist Party and Chiang Kai-shek, who says that he's the rightful leader of China. Well, the communists have a different opinion of that. And this descends into civil war. This war is going to go on for 4 years. And at the end of that war, the communists are going to take over and people are going to flee. So around 2 million people flee to Taiwan as refugees at the end of the Chinese Civil War. They do not want to stay in China that is going to be ruled by the communists. People who had money know that they're going to be targeted. People who are tied in with the KMT know that they're going to be targeted. And many of the soldiers also, whether they like it or not, are being forced to come to Taiwan. And so you have this massive exodus of people arrive on the islands of Taiwan. 2 years after their government just crushed a rebellion of Taiwanese people on the island. Just going to make things even more awkward. So our next object that we're going to be looking at is beef noodle soup. Raise your hand if you've had beef noodle soup before. Yes, it's getting close to lunchtime. All right. So many people see beef noodle soup as a quintessential Taiwanese dish. But this is actually not a quintessential Taiwanese dish. This is only something that came to Taiwan after 1949. This is a relatively new cuisine in Taiwan, and it has to do with both the United States and also all of the refugees coming from China. And it also has to do with the Cold War. So remember I told you that the United States really didn't like Chiang Kai-shek. They'd actually kind of given up on him by the time he lost the Civil War. But luckily for Chiang Kai-shek, another civil war started in 1950. Kim Il-sung, communist, invaded South Korea and tried to take it over in 1950. Here's the map of how that war went. He would have been successful if the United States and the United Nations had not intervened. And in the middle of this war, the Americans realized, at least to themselves, communism is on the march. So we need to stop communism on the march. Oh, that means we're going to have to help out Chiang Kai-shek. So in 1952, the Americans signed a mutual defense treaty with the ROC in Taiwan, basically saying, we're going to protect you. This is the saving grace for Chiang Kai-shek. The Americans are going to be there because they don't want to see this happen furthermore in Asia. And so the Americans are here, right? The Americans start building military bases. They start providing significant aid. Some of the aid they provide is wheat. Wheat was not common in Taiwan prior to this. The most common grain that people ate were rice. And so people are bringing in wheat. That's free food that they're getting from the Americans. You have people coming from China all over different provinces, especially some people from northern provinces where wheat was more common, and they start making noodles. All right? And that means that Taiwan's most famous cuisine today is actually a product of this Cold War history, where the United States is helping out the Republic of China in Taiwan to try to not become communist. And there's all these people who have fled from China to Taiwan, and they bring their foodways with them. So we have beef noodle soup. We have, eventually, Din Tai Fung, right? And the soup dumplings that they serve at Din Tai Fung are not originally from Taiwan. This is a Shanghaiese delicacy because the people who started Din Tai Fung, right, came from China. So they're trying to have their own foodways. Taiwan has made that famous, and now it's become Taiwanese, part of their imagined community. But it's not really a traditional food here. So then we enter what we call the fifth colonial era, the Authoritarian Republic of China in Taiwan. And this is going to go from 1949 to about 1987-ish. And during this time, Taiwan is the ROC. And the ROC is the imagined community of China. So when they're here, they claim to be the rightful rulers of China, but they're only in Taiwan. And Chiang Kai-shek is saying, we're going to go back. We are China. We're the free China. Look at the map behind him. It's not a map of Taiwan. Certainly it's on there, but the bigger part of it is all China. So they are going to be, quote unquote, free China during this era. And when they get here, they try to impose China onto Taiwan in many ways. It had just been a Japanese colony for 50 years. So what do? They start renaming the roads. Zhongshan Road, named after Sun Yat-sen. Zhongzhen Road, named after Chiang Kai-shek. Sun Yat-sen's main philosophy was the three principles of the people. This is what he was trying to convince people to follow when he was trying to get them to follow him to overthrow the warlords. So, streets in Taiwan named after the three principles of the people. Minzu, Minchuan, Minsheng. These are the three principles of the people. So they're not just random streets. These are things named after things very important to the KMT. They also named a number of streets after the 8 virtues of classical Confucianism. Zhongxiao Road, loyalty and filial piety. It sounds really weird in English. Where do you live? Oh, I live in loyalty and filial piety intersection. Ren'ai, human-heartedness and love. Xinyi, honesty and righteousness. Heping, harmony and peace. So lots of street names in Taipei and other cities all around are actually just things that came from China. But it's actually more intense than that. Here's a map of downtown Taipei. I'm gonna let you look at it for a second before I click the button. So the next time you're downtown and you get lost and you don't have your phone on you, stay with me. You just have to remember the map of China. And you can be like, oh, yeah, Guilin, yeah, that's in the southwest, therefore I must be in the southwest part of the city. So they literally took the map of China and implemented it onto the streets of Taipei. They had to rename everything because everything had Japanese names. And so, what are they going to do? They're going to Chineseify everything. There you go. They even changed the calendar. So the rest of the world, it's 2024. In the ROC today, it's the year 113 or 113. You've probably been confused before when you've gone to the doctor or you looked at your 𝗕𝗿 card and you're like, I'm not that old, am I? Because they're using the start of the Republic of China back in China as the start of their calendar. So it's been 113 years since the start of the ROC in China, which of course has nothing to do with the people who were here in Taiwan who were being controlled by the Japanese. The other thing they did is to make Taiwan as a part of this imagined community of China, they also enforced new language rules. The people in Taiwan at home would speak Taiwanese before the ROC got here, and they also learned Japanese. So the Japanese education system taught the vast majority of people to read and write in Japanese. And so they're all speakers of Taiwanese and Japanese. Now, 2 million plus people arrive, and they're like, guess what? Taiwanese and Japanese, not allowed. You have to learn Mandarin. Mandarin was chosen as the national language earlier in the century, before the communists came into power, by the ROC themselves. There was actually a vote in the 19-teens about what language to make the national language of China. Cantonese almost won. It lost. But Mandarin, which is a northern Chinese language, won, and that became the language of the ROC. So when they moved here, they said, okay, everyone's going to speak Mandarin. What if you're in school? You're in 9th grade, you're in 10th grade. You don't speak Mandarin. You have to learn. So everyone is going to now have to learn a new language to function in this new society. So they've really implanted things from China on Taiwan. No one's a Mandarin speaker in Taiwan, right? They're speaking Taiwanese, which is from Southeast China, mutually unintelligible, different. So, I'm a teacher. What are the schools like? Schools are great places to convince the young people of what you want them to do, right? They're young, they're naive, they want to please their teacher. So the ROC is going to imagine Taiwan as part of China through the education system. This is an excerpt from an elementary school geography textbook used in the first 2 decades of the ROC control. Let's read. A discussion between the student 𝗕𝗿 and his father begins with the father saying, "Our hometown is Nanjing. This beautiful city is now occupied by the evil communists. We have come to Taiwan for more than a decade now and have lived a most comfortable life. Please do not forget our splendid homeland." 𝗕𝗿 responds, "We should recover the mainland as soon as possible and go back to Nanjing." So in the first 2 decades, students in school are going to be learning, our goal is to go back to China. Our home is in China. Everyone is learning this. But not everybody's home is back in China, right? There were more people already here. There were about 8 million, I think, who were already here besides the 2 million that arrived. So the majority of the population, their hometown is not Nanjing. So what are they going to do about this, right? They got lessons. So this one is also another lesson in the same geography textbooks, same time period. This is a discussion between the son, 𝗕𝗿, nation building, and his father as they visit an ancestral tomb. And it begins with the father saying, "Our 𝗕𝗏, like our hometown, our old home, our ancestral home, is Fujian province. And our ancestors came to Taiwan around 150 years ago. It has not been easy to establish a new home in Taiwan, and it is equally difficult to establish a country. A country is like a home to all citizens. All of us are children of Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, the mythical founder of Chinese civilization, and thus members of a big family. We should support and befriend each other and try our best to build this big family together." So the majority of people in Taiwan, their roots are in Fujian province, and now the government is telling you, oh, because your ancestors came over 200 years ago, you're actually Chinese. This would be like in the US, trying to convince everybody, oh, actually you're British. Even if you don't remember who your ancestors are, who came over, that's who you are. And remember, the Taiwanese just revolted in 1947 and got crushed. And now in school, they're teaching them, actually, you're the same as us. We're the same people. And if you spoke Taiwanese in schools, the teacher would hit you. So you have to speak Mandarin. And you have to regurgitate what the teacher tells you, right? This is the way education system worked. So therefore, yes, China is our homeland. So let's go back to 𝗕𝗿, who says, history textbooks have been used by states as instruments for glorifying the nation, consolidating its national identity, and justifying particular forms of social and political systems. All countries do this, right? All countries try to convince the people in that country that they are a joint, imagined community. And schools are the greatest place to do this, right? Young people, lap it up. So, I've been calling the Republic of China and Taiwan a colonial state. Was it really a colonial state? This is from J. Megan Green, who says, yes. And she says, citizens of the Japanese, British, and French empires were taught to communicate in the languages of the colonizers, just like Taiwan, and to think of themselves not in relation to their own pasts, which were described to them as primitive and culturally deficient, but instead in relation to the past of the motherland. We see that exact thing happening in that text I just showed you. She says, even though the KMT did not see itself as a colonizer, they've lost their home after all, its tactics were essentially colonial in nature. It's education narrative that ignored Taiwan's particular past and taught students to locate themselves in Chinese rather than Japanese or Taiwanese history. So their imagined community is Taiwan is part of China. Everyone here is Chinese. This is the way it's going to be. Advancement then up the academic ladder and of society in Taiwan under the ROC required memorization of its history. You had to parrot what the government told you. Otherwise, you could not move forward. And so the KMT state used this to define identity in Taiwan in ways that suited its own agenda. What if you didn't agree with the government? What if you thought, you know what, actually, I'm Taiwanese. No, I'm not Chinese. I don't like these ideas. Well, they had a place for you. You get a free trip to Green Island, which had political prisons on it during this time. So there was no dissent allowed of this idea that the ROC was China and everyone was Chinese. And if you didn't like that, you could go there. Meanwhile, back in China, Mao is leading his communist revolution. He's built a cult of personality around himself. They have a great leap forward in which they starve 40 to 60 million of their people, though the propaganda suggests they should also save the people in Taiwan from the ROC. So their goal is, we're going to take Taiwan and save them from the nationalists. That's what their propaganda is saying. And during this time, the US is here in Taiwan. The Cold War is going on. They're supporting Chiang Kai-shek because he's not communist, right? It's a capitalist country, and they're trying to prevent communism from taking over. So while they're throwing people in Green Island's political prison, the US is just looking the other way. And they're providing military aid, food aid, agricultural aid. And so they're here, right? There are military bases all over Taiwan during this era. In fact, here is a military base right up the street from us. That's TAS. But you probably don't recognize it because TAS is there now. But where TAS is located was actually military barracks. So the US military was there until 1979. And they were all over the island in various places, and they're there. Navy compound. All right. Yes, there were a whole bunch, yeah. And so the Cold War keeps going on, and eventually, in 1971, the United Nations, the member states, decide that the farce of the Republic of China having the China seat in the United Nations, which they still had, is ridiculous. And so they vote to kick them out. In 1971, they have a vote, and the ROC is removed. This means that now, in 1971, the ROC is not a member state of where all the other states in the world meet. They're kind of out in the international wilderness. And the PRC is sitting there in the China seat. And then, to make things even more awkward for the ROC, their biggest ally in 1972 goes to China and visits Mao Zedong. So I like to describe this as the United States cheating on the ROC out in public, right? They're their biggest supporter. And yet here he is, whining and dining with Chiang Kai-shek's biggest enemy. And this is the beginning of what eventually is going to be derecognition, eventually. When Richard Nixon leaves, they sign a document that's very important for understanding the US PRC ROC relationship. It's called the Shanghai Communique. This is just an excerpt from it. And it's awkward. Let's read it. The US acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States does not challenge that position. Now, if Chiang Kai-shek read this, he would say, yeah, that makes sense, because I'm China. And all people on both sides are definitely Chinese. And the PRC would say, yeah, that makes sense, except we're the real China. And the United Nations now says we're the real China. So the ROC is in a difficult spot. This is going to govern their relationship moving forward. There's a couple more documents that they sign that's going to make things even more awkward. So the Shanghai Communique in February 1972, and then December of 1978, the United States signs the Normalization Communique with the PRC. This solidifies the US-PRC relationship. They de-recognize the ROC. They recognize the PRC. The US military leaves Taiwan. TAS's population goes from 2,000 students to 700 students in 1 year because the vast majority of the students were military kids. In the spring of 1979, the US Congress passes the Taiwan Relations Act. The Taiwan Relations Act essentially says the problem of Taiwan should be solved peacefully by the Chinese themselves, whatever that means. But we're going to sell weapons to Taiwan just in case. So the US continues to sell weapons to Taiwan so that it can defend itself against the country we just recognize as the real country. And that's the situation that we're in today. I'm going to skip past him. And so Taiwan's in a really awkward spot, right? They're not in the UN. They've now lost their biggest ally, the US, by the end of the 1970s. So they need the rest of the world to recognize them. One of the ways they do this is through Little League Baseball. In the 1970s, as the ROC starts entering the international wilderness, their Little League Baseball team takes the world by storm and starts dominating everyone. And this becomes a source of pride for the ROC. Initially, when the ROC got here, they tried to stamp out baseball because it was brought by the Japanese. Eventually, they realized they could not do that, and then they realized, hey, actually, we can use this as propaganda. These guys are winning, and it makes people proud in our nation. And in fact, they're so proud, you might have seen these people before, they're on the 500 NT bill, right? Those are Little League Baseball players. And so in the 1970s, this was the pride of Taiwan, but everyone knew them as Chinese Taipei. I remember growing up playing Little League Baseball and being like, who are these Chinese Taipei guys? They're crushing everyone all the time. Where is this? I'm looking on the map, right? At a globe. Where's Chinese Taipei? I didn't know. No idea. And so eventually, most countries decide to de-recognize the ROC. And during the 1980s and 1990s, there's actually a war going on between the ROC and the PRC for recognition. Basically, they're going through dollar diplomacy. Many countries are up for bid if you want to recognize the ROC or the PRC. So, Burkina Faso, for example, might say, not so sure if you're China, the ROC. Maybe you want to, give us something. And so the ROC would spend a lot of money, maybe building them a soccer stadium, building them a port, doing something. This happened all around the world, and then they would get their recognition. You could only recognize the ROC or the PRC. And the PRC would show up. Hey, would you like something? We're China, right? And then they would switch back and forth. So this happened to a number of places, and they bought them off. Today, the ROC no longer buys off countries to recognize them as the ROC. I made this list about 10 years ago, and I keep using it because I have to keep crossing off countries, right? And you probably notice in the news every few months, there seems to be a new country that decides to recognize the PRC and not the ROC. And these are not the strongest countries in the world that are the countries that recognize the ROC anymore, right? Tuvalu has 11,000 people. But they're a nation, and they're in the United Nations, and the ROC is not, right? Many of these countries, their embassy is in Tianmu, right? The stream over here, if you walk up it, on the right-hand side, there's a really large building. There's a bunch of flagpoles out front. There's a bunch of flagpoles that are empty because there used to be some more countries there. And that's where they're mostly housed. And so this is the awkward political nature of the ROC today. And it's a dictatorship, right? The ROC is a dictatorship, and it's passing power from one father to a son. I often ask my students, I'm like, what other countries in Asia were dictatorships that passed power from a father to a son? And they all shout, North Korea. This is true. And so Taiwan is similar to North Korea in that it's a dictatorship and power is staying in the same family. Not a great look at this point. And so our next object is Barbie. Who saw the Barbie movie? The Barbie movie actually has a lot to do with Taiwan. So let's talk about it. Yeah. Taiwan, during this authoritarian era in the 70s and into the 80s, actually became the producers of the world's stuff. All right. Toy Story. One of the names for the movie Toy Story, one of the ones they thought about using was actually called Made in Taiwan. Because at one point, everybody's stuff was made in Taiwan. That's not the case anymore. But during this era, it was. So in the 1950s, the US helps out. They provide significant agricultural, financial, and technical aid. The ROC by the late 50s is going to begin encouraging exports, right? They realize this is a way for us to get wealthier. And they provide subsidies for industries working with plastic, synthetic fibers, and electronic components. So they're helping these people out. And Taiwan develops largely as contract manufacturers. They're going to make other companies' stuff. Mattel needs Barbies made. They don't want to make them in the US. It's too expensive. So they need to find somewhere else to make them. And Taiwanese producers say, hey, we can do that. No problem. So at one point in the early 1980s, Taiwan makes 80% of all of the world's Barbies. So if you were playing with a Barbie in the early 80s and early 90s, it probably was made in Taiwan. And see, these are all contract manufacturers. So you probably don't know most of these companies. So for example, this company up here, Pochen, is actually the world's largest producer of sneakers. They probably made the sneakers you're wearing, but they didn't make them in Taiwan today. They used to make them here, and now they've largely moved that manufacturing to China and then to Vietnam and other countries where they can have cheaper labor. But during the 70s and into the 80s, this is what Taiwan's economy was based on, contract manufacturing. But they never had the brand, right? They were making it for other people. So let's go from Barbies and sneakers to iPhones and semiconductors. Terry Gou, who just ran for president, and the founder of Foxconn, began making molded plastic parts for firms like Atari in the 1980s. That's how he got his start. Eventually, he became a key supplier for Apple. The iPhone is invented and obviously does very well for him, right? Almost all of these are made by Foxconn. They're all made in China. Taiwan Semiconductor was started in 1987 by Morris Chang. He used to work in the US at Texas Instruments. The Taiwanese government encouraged him to come back. They funded him money through the Industrial Technology Research Institute. And by 2015, TSMC was the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer, and they're 5 times larger than anyone in the entire world. And so today, we think of Taiwan as being a tech hub. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, right? They were making everybody's plastic stuff and their sneakers and their fibers, synthetic fibers, back in the 70s and 80s. And so as Taiwan made its economic gains, they started also having democratic demands. And so we're going to see Taiwan make its move on the way to democracy. I'm calling this Taiwan becomes Taiwan. In 1979, there is a protest led against the government who was shut down a magazine called the Formosa magazine. People in Taiwan are demanding greater rights, greater freedom of press, and the government crushes them, all right? So some of the people involved in this protest, a lady named 𝗔𝗄, who gets sent to prison, later on becomes the mayor of Kaohsiung for many years, and then served in the Tsai Ing-wen administration most recently. The lawyer of many of these people who got arrested was a guy named Chen Shui-bian. Chen Shui-bian will later on become the president of Taiwan in 2000. So people are pushing back against the authoritarian ROC. But the ROC is not letting up. One of the members of the people who fought back against the government in the Kaohsiung incident and got sent to prison was a man named Lin Yixiang. And something happened to his family on 2/28/1980. So his wife visited him in prison. He told his wife that he had been tortured and that had he said anything, his family would be in danger. And so the next day, despite his house being under 24-hour surveillance, someone broke into his home, murdered his mother and his two twin daughters, who you see there on the screen. The other daughter almost died but survived, despite the fact that the government was watching the house, the police was watching the house. The crime never solved. Unsurprisingly, many people are blaming the KMT government for this, right? That they are the ones responsible for this, but we never know. We don't know actually what happened. Then there's another death. In 1981, 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝘁, who was a professor at Carnegie Mellon in the US, came back to visit his family. He was found dead on the NTU campus after he had been called in to talk with authorities. The authorities said he committed suicide. Today, this is a report from a couple years ago, it's believed that he was murdered by security forces. And this is obviously a bad look for the ROC as an authoritarian state. The US has already de-recognized them. They're in the international wilderness. They're killing people who might be threats to them. Here's a service for 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝘁 back in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he was a professor. I don't know if you can all see this, but you'll notice that the people are there protesting at his funeral with bags on their heads. They're doing this because they don't want to be photographed, because the KMT government is watching people in the US. And that's in part how 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝘁 was caught, because he had ideas about Taiwan independence. He came back, they questioned him, and that was his end. So if you're in the US and you're Taiwanese, you're not free of the authoritarian state. And in fact, they're spying on you, literally. So on the left, you see reported spying incidences in the US at campuses between 1964 and 1991. Students were reporting on fellow students. So if you're sitting there and you're talking, you're like, Chiang Kai-shek, that guy, he's terrible. Here is literally the report form that they were filling out and sending back to Taiwan, to the ROC government. And then if you return to Taiwan, you'd have to go in for a talk. You might not make it out. Then in 1984, Henry Liu, who had written a critical biography of Chiang Ching-kuo, was murdered. One of the people likely involved in this murder is a guy named Chang An-lo, who was a member of the Bamboo Union Gang. They're still around, and he lives in Taiwan today. You might see him at pro-unification rallies. He still shows up. I don't know if you've ever seen the people down by Taipei 101 that are waving their PRC flags. He's involved with those people. Then in 1986, the Democratic Progressive Party is formed, and they form it in the Grand Hotel, which was built by Madam Chiang Kai-shek. The choice of location was not by accident. They did this on purpose, and this is a pro-Taiwan political party. They want Taiwan to be Taiwan. They do not want to be part of China. That is their political platform. Then in 1987, Chiang Ching-kuo announces that martial law will end, and they're going to begin moving towards having some more rights as citizens in the ROC, and perhaps towards democracy. You might notice in the background, there's a English language secretary taking some notes. That man is Ma Ying-jeou. Ma Ying-jeou becomes the president in 2008, and he was Chiang Ching-kuo's English language secretary in the 1980s. Chiang Ching-kuo dies in 1988, and when he does not pass power down to his son, so we are not like North Korea. There's not going to be a third Chiang in charge. Instead, he passes power down to his vice president. His vice president is a man named Lee Teng-hui. Lee Teng-hui is an interesting person because he's not from China. He was born in Taiwan in the Japanese colonial era. His Japanese is actually better than his Mandarin. He studied in Japan. He studied in the US. He got his PhD at Cornell University, and he came back to Taiwan to help improve agriculture. He got brought into the government by the KMT in the early 1970s, rose up the ranks, and by 1988, he is the vice president. But he's Taiwanese, right? He's not from China. He is someone who is from this island originally. And he's going to be important to the eventual move towards democracy. He eventually is going to leave the KMT and become a fervent supporter of Taiwan independence after he's out of politics. Many people in the KMT see him as essentially a turncoat, but he has a very interesting arc. But Taiwan is still not yet a democracy, and people are pushing back. In 1989, Qing Dynasty burns himself alive in his office in Taipei as the government is coming in to arrest him for things he had published. So there's still not freedom of speech. At his funeral in Taipei, another man burns himself alive. And so we have two people who've done this in 1989. In 1990, young people gather in downtown Taipei to demand changes in Taiwan. And so they have four demands: dissolve the National Assembly, reestablish constitutional order, hold National Affairs Conference, and set democratic reforms timetable. These are all things that 𝗕𝗙ꯪance is going to say yes to. This is 1 year after Chinese students in China had very similar demands, and Deng Xiaoping decided to run them over with tanks. 𝗕𝗙ꯪance does not do that, and instead he actually meets their demands. And so, our next object is this Tsai Ing-wen campaign figurine as we move our way towards Taiwan's democracy. So let's talk about Taiwan becoming Taiwan as we know it and the democratic era from the 1990s until today. There's a lot here. Essentially, Taiwan starts to move away from the Taiwan as China. There was something called the National Assembly. The National Assembly was full of people who were representing areas in China. So there was a person representing Shanghai, person representing Chengdu, all these different areas, and they were really old because they couldn't get voted out because they couldn't have elections again. So eventually, 𝗕𝗙ꯪance got them to step down, all right? And we start moving towards having other democratic. First, you can see them either on the board, direct elections of the mayors in 1994, direct election of the provincial governor, the province of Taiwan, right? In 1994, that doesn't exist anymore because we're just Taiwan now. And they're moving towards democracy. They also realize they need to do things to make people like them. And so the government decides, let's have a national health care plan. This gets instituted in 1995, right? So they're responding to demands of the people and trying to provide things for them. And then in 1996, there are the first presidential elections in Taiwan's history. These are free and fair elections. 𝗕𝗙ꯪance wins. He's already the president. People vote for him with 54% of the vote. The DPP's candidate comes in second. In the lead up to the elections, the PRC starts launching missiles, coincidentally, off the coasts of Taiwan to try to intimidate Taiwan. The US decides to sail its warships through the Taiwan Strait. This is also an era in which the PRC's military is not like the PRC's military today, so they stand down. The elections go forward, and Taiwan is now a functional democracy. Then, in 2000, there's going to be another election. And in this election, the DPP candidate wins, the pro-Taiwan candidate. The KMT is going to be out of power for the first time in their history as rulers of the Republic of China. Chen Shui-bian is a pro-Taiwan person. And so, what can he do? If he declares independence, China might declare war. They have to change the constitution. It's too complicated. So, one of the things he does is he starts changing the history textbooks. The history textbooks had all been focused on China. So, he de-Sinicizes the history textbooks in China. He says, some people fail to recognize that our national history is not Chinese history. And our national geography is not Chinese geography. They think our national geography should include China and the Mongolian Republic, but no, China is just another country. And so, ooh, just happened. Oh boy. Oh no. Sorry. Something's happening. Anyone want to help? I'm not sure what happened. Take out.
Well, because of the mouse.
I don't know.
I think this is like
You can take the mouse out.
virus. Yeah, I think that's a. I have my work with you.
I can plug mine in if you want. Can you grab it out of my bag over there? What happened?
Oh, you're putting the link in one of the links. Where's your bag?
Oh, it's over.
And all you did is you hit the view button and you transferred into viewing the source code.
Ah,
For the Google, all you got to do is switch your view.
switch the view. Do you know how to do it?
Back in your browser.
In the browser. Can you do it?
It's not, we can't even open that.
Can't even open it.
So that's Chrome, right? You're using Chrome.
Yeah.
I can't do anything with my computer now, to be honest.
Okay. Don't Google that. This,
I'll put it on mine.
I have a charger. Do you need a charger?
It's okay. Yeah, I think we're okay. We're almost done.
we see that.
Okay, I got it on here. There we go. There we go. Just plug it in here. We're good. Yep. Right. Ooh.
Yep, there we go.
Okay, we're back. Okay, so one of the things that happens during Chen Shui-bian's era is he's trying to de-Sinicize China in any way that he can. He can't declare independence. It's too complicated. It might start a war. So they try to get rid of as much as they can, the evidence of the China that came before them there. So the airport used to be called Chiang Kai-shek International Airport. As we all know now, it's Taipei International Airport. Downtown, the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, which was constructed in 1980. I mean, there I am with more hair. In 2007, they actually renamed it the National Taiwan Democracy Memorial Hall. He's still there, and they renamed it back to Chiang Kai-shek. But there was this moment where they tried to get rid of it. And they also got rid of all the statues of him. So during Chiang Kai-shek's era and afterwards, there were statues of him all over the island, thousands of them. And if you go out to Taoyuan, where he's buried, actually, outside of his burial area, there's hundreds of Chiang Kai-shek statues. It's a very interesting place to visit because it's just those are all him. And they used to be in front of all of the schools, especially around the island. And now that the authoritarian era is over, they've removed them. You can still see some Chiang Kai-shek statues around Taiwan in places, but they're really very few compared to what it used to be in the past. In 2008, the KMT is going to win the presidency again, and Ma Ying-jeou, right, Chiang Ching-kuo's language secretary, becomes the president. He was not born in Taiwan. He still feels that Taiwan should be part or closer to China. So he's going to change things to try to move Taiwan back closer with China in some ways. And he does this in a number of ways. So tourists from China are going to be allowed to come to Taiwan for the first time during Ma Ying-jeou's era. I remember this because when I moved to Taiwan in 2007, there were no Chinese tourists here. So when you went to sites, actually, there were very few people there unless it was a Taiwanese holiday and then it was full of people. But you probably all remember, if you were here before COVID, Chinese tourists came in large numbers and they went all over the island in their tour buses, brought significant investment, right? Helped spur the tourist industry a lot. But also, many Taiwanese saw the Chinese in large numbers for the first time. And I think that convinced many Taiwanese people that they actually were quite different than the people coming from China. So that was an interesting moment. In 2008, also, we got pandas. So Ma Ying-jeou accepted pandas from China. They were very nice. They named them for Taiwan, which together, Tuan Tuan Yuan Yuan means reunion. So they named them, let's get back together again, pandas. In 2012, President Ma claimed to be a descendant of the mythical founder of Chinese civilization, the Yellow Emperor. That was the same emperor that we saw in the geography lesson that I showed you earlier. And in 2014, the government tries to alter the nation's history curriculum to be more China-centric. So they're using, right, the education system to try to make Taiwan the imagined community that he wants it to be. So there's this fight over, what exactly is Taiwan and how close should it be to China? This is him meeting Xi Jinping after he was the president. In 2014, an important moment happened in which young people decided to protest against a trade agreement that was getting pushed through the government. And so they gathered in the streets, hundreds of thousands of people, and they even occupied the legislative yuan. And they ended up making this agreement not happen. There were many people who believed in Taiwan that they were getting too close to China. And so they occupied this and they managed to make the government change. There was no violence, right? And so this was a turning point for Taiwan because in the next election, the DPP, the pro-Taiwan party, swept. They had the presidency and the legislature for the first time in Taiwan's history. So this means that for the first time in the ROC's history, the KMT had no political power, right? They were in the opposition. You can see in the background somebody you might notice. Yeah, the president in a couple of weeks, right? However, the reporting on Taiwan internationally is always a little bit awkward. When Tsai Ing-wen won, here's the cover for Time magazine. She could lead the only Chinese democracy, which is interesting because if you look at what people in Taiwan think they are, today they think they're Taiwanese, mostly. But the international media is saying otherwise. In 2020, Tsai Ing-wen won again. You can see Lai Ching-te there as well, and Chen Chu, the former political prisoner. And here's what she said at her speech. She said, "This election result carries an added significance. They have shown that when our sovereignty and democracy are threatened, the Taiwanese will shout our determination even more loudly back. With each presidential election, Taiwan is showing how much we cherish our free democratic way of life and how much we cherish our nation. This is a different place than it was a generation or so ago." And our last object that we're going to look at is the N95 mask. We all remember these well. All right. So the interesting thing about COVID is that Taiwan got a lot of positive press during COVID, right? As I don't know who was here in 2020, but I remember 2020 being actually quite a good year in Taiwan. I traveled wherever I wanted to do. I did whatever I wanted to do. The schools did not close for any length of time. And everyone else outside of Taiwan was living a pretty closed experience. I never experienced that in Taiwan, in part because of the response. So there's been lots of articles written about what Taiwan did, why they did it, and how it worked. And this has actually put Taiwan, I think, out into the world in ways that people did not know about it before. After COVID, I don't think I ever got a question about, do you like Thai food? Because people were reading about Taiwan and they knew better by this point. And so this was actually good for Taiwan in some levels, although I have to admit I did not enjoy staying in a hotel room for 2 weeks straight at my own expense, returning to Taiwan from the US one summer. And so, who are Taiwanese people and how do they identify themselves? It's changed over time. And I want to point this out as the idea of this imagined community. Back in 1992, the largest response to who are you was, I'm both Taiwanese and Chinese, and Taiwanese alone was down at 10%. So not that long ago, if you ask people in Taiwan who they were, the answer is both Taiwanese and Chinese and not really Taiwanese. If you ask people today, 2/3 of people, their answer is Taiwanese. And only Chinese is really small, 2.5%. So it's changed a lot, right? As Taiwan has become a democracy, as people have been allowed to say what they want, things have changed a lot in this country in who they are and who they think they are. And so there's also interviews with people about what you want to do. What do you want the future of Taiwan to be? They've asked people. Back in 1994, maintain the status quo, whatever that means. Decide at a later date. Maintain the status quo indefinitely. Move towards independence. If you add up these, it's around 80%. And really what that means is if you want to maintain the status quo and decide at a later date, or maintain the status quo indefinitely, or move towards independence, you want Taiwan to be Taiwan and not be part of China anymore. And so the vast majority of people in Taiwan today in 2023, but not necessarily back in 1992, think that the future of Taiwan should be Taiwan. And so Taiwan has, changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. I'm not sure if you recognize where this is, but I think you will once I show you a more modern day shot from the same spot. So this is the 1990s, not that long ago, right? Taiwan has changed a lot, both politically and physically on the ground. And, in the end, what is Taiwan, right? What is Taiwan and who are the people of Taiwan? Ultimately, I think, that should be up to the people of Taiwan to imagine who they are and then to decide what they want their nation to be. And I think that is where Taiwan is headed. And that's what I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and thank you all of you for being. I've been a part of the coffee morning, so this is amazing. Hopefully you can join us for our future activities, coffee morning.